Alright, so moving on to the final segment, I'll be sharing my top 5 UFC fighters that have never won a world title. So I'll be ranking them from 5 all the way to 1 to these respective UFC fighters that have never won a UFC title in the organization. So at number 5, I have Nate Diaz. Nate Diaz is known for being one of the biggest stars to never win a UFC world title. He was always a championship contender throughout his UFC career. The only time he ever came close to winning a UFC world title came back in 2012 when he lost against Benson Henderson by decision. That was his only close chance of ever winning a UFC world title from sticking with the UFC organization for quite some time. Nate Diaz has never won a world title. At number 4, I have his brother, Nick Diaz. Nick Diaz, just like his brother, was very talented, a big star in the UFC that failed to win a UFC world title. Now, Nick Diaz, I do believe it was the better fighter between him and Nate Diaz in the MMA. But Nick Diaz did have some success on the outside companies and the other MMA companies outside of UFC. He won titles in the WEC and the Strike Force, won titles in those two respective organizations, but never won a world title in the UFC. His losses against Carlos and George St. Pierre cost him a chance of being a world champion in the UFC. Nick Diaz, as talented as he was, unfortunately never won a world title in the UFC. At number 3, I have Colby Covington. Now, Colby Covington is a former interim world champion in the UFC, but he's never won a UFC world title. Failed to cash in on his welterweight title opportunities against Kamaru Usman, losing against Kamaru Usman twice. But he was he showed a competitive outing in both of those fights. Obviously, the first time when those two fought, Kamaru Usman knocked him out. Then the second time, it went all 5 championship rounds going to the judges' scorecards. So nothing to be ashamed of. Both of those outings were very competitive for Michael Chandler, but he has an opportunity to win his first UFC world title when he gets a UFC welterweight championship opportunity against Leon Edwards late in 2023. We'll see if he can cash in on that opportunity. At number 2, I have Donald Cowboy Cerrone. Donald Cowboy Cerrone was always a fan favorite in the UFC world and was a great kickboxer. And Donald Cowboy Cerrone, his resume in the UFC was top notch. It just mind blows me that he never won a UFC world title. He had a total of 23 UFC victories. He had a total of 16 UFC finishes and had 20 UFC knockouts. The fact that the great Donald Cowboy Cerrone never won a world title is mind-boggling to me, but he's number 2 on my list. But at number 1, I do believe that Dustin Poirier is the best UFC fighter to never win a UFC world title. Now, Dustin Poirier is a former interim world champion, interim lightweight champion, and has defeated 3 former lightweight world champions in the UFC, defeating Anthony Pettis, defeating Eddie Alvarez, and Conor McGregor twice. He has defeated Max Holloway and Justin Gaethje and Michael Chandler. So he is developing a great resume. Dustin Poirier has a great resume. It's just mind-boggling. As good as his resume is, he's just never won a UFC world title, but he has to be number 1 in terms of best UFC fighters to never win a UFC world title. But that is all the time I have for you guys today. Thank you guys for watching. Thank you guys for listening. This is your host, Thomas Tyree, signing off, and I'll see you guys on next week's episode.